Chapter 1: The Man in the Margins. Brian Collins had never thought of himself as invisible. Not exactly. Invisible suggested absence, and Brian was rarely absent. He showed up, consistently, reliably, almost predictably. If someone needed help moving a couch, assembling a desk, fixing a stubborn cabinet hinge, Brian was there. If someone texted about coffee, he replied within minutes. If plans were made, he attended. He was present. He just wasn't noted. This distinction had taken him years to understand, and even then, it came less as a revelation and more as a quiet acknowledgement. Like noticing a piece of furniture had always been in the room, functional but unremarkable. Brian didn't resent it. Not anymore. At 29, resentment felt like wasted effort. He sat at his kitchen table, one hand loosely holding his phone, the other wrapped around a mug that had long since cooled. The apartment was quiet in the way he preferred. No television murmuring, no music filling gaps that didn't need filling. Just the occasional passing car outside and the faint hum of appliances doing their work. His phone buzzed. Mark, coffee Friday? Same place, 7? Brian read the message once, then again, not because he needed to, but because habit demanded confirmation. It was always the same kind of invitation. Casual. Assumed. Reliable. He typed his response. I'm out of town for a couple weeks. I'll catch you next time. He stared at the message for a second, thumb hovering, before pressing send. The screen dimmed. Conversation over. Brian leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It hadn't felt like a significant moment, yet something about the finality of it lingered. Not the declining of coffee, that had never felt like a loss, but the quiet realization that this was the first time he'd stepped outside the pattern. A couple weeks, he murmured aloud, testing the phrase. It sounded longer when spoken. He picked up his mug, took a small sip, and winced at the cold bitterness. Setting it down again, he pushed his chair back and stood, stretching briefly as if preparing himself for something more strenuous than packing a bag. Across the room, his suitcase sat open on the couch, half filled with neatly folded clothes. Brian approached it, considering its contents with the same careful thought he applied to most things. 2 weeks. It wasn't a long trip, but it was longer than anything he'd taken in years. Vacations had never quite fit into his life, not because he couldn't afford them, but because he hadn't known what he'd be stepping away from. Now he knew the answer. Routine. That, more than anything, was what he was leaving. He folded another shirt, placed it into the suitcase, and paused again. The movement slowed, then stopped altogether as a thought surfaced, uninvited but persistent. Should I have told them? Brian tilted his head slightly, as if examining the question from a different angle might produce a different answer. Told them what? He said, voice soft but clear in the empty room. That I'm going home? He considered the practical aspect first. Would it have changed anything? They'd still meet for coffee. They'd still talk about work, relationships, plans, frustrations, stories he listened to more than participated in. They'd still assume he was fine because he always was, and Brian would still return later, slotting back into place without disruption. No, he concluded quietly. It wouldn't matter. The answer settled comfortably, familiar in its logic. Brian zipped his suitcase halfway and stepped back, surveying the room. His apartment was tidy without being staged, lived in without being cluttered. Everything had its place, and nothing seemed out of place. It struck him briefly that his life looked exactly like that. Functional, orderly, undemanding, and entirely self-contained. He reached for his phone again, opening his calendar. His 30th birthday sat there, marked without emphasis. No notes, no reminders, just a date. 30. Brian let out a small breath, somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. That's supposed to mean something, he said. He wasn't sure what. For most people, it seemed to carry weight, expectations of progress, milestones, achievements. For Brian, it felt more like a checkpoint that had appeared without warning. He tapped the date, as if expecting more information to reveal itself. Didn't. What do you want? He asked the empty room. The question landed differently. It wasn't rhetorical, not entirely. Brian frowned slightly, lowering himself onto the edge of the couch beside the suitcase. He rested his elbows on his knees, phone dangling loosely from his hand. He'd spent years responding to needs, to invitations, to circumstances. Wanting, actively choosing, had never been part of his routine. Not because he couldn't, because he hadn't needed to. Until now. I don't know, he admitted. There was something unsettling about saying it out loud. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just unfamiliar. Brian straightened, pushing himself up with a quiet resolve that didn't quite feel like confidence, but wasn't uncertainty either. That's the point, he said. I'm going to find out. The simplicity of the statement steadied him. He finished packing quickly after that, movements more decisive. Shirts folded, shoes tucked in, toiletries zipped into place. Within minutes, the suitcase was closed, upright, ready. Brian glanced around the apartment one last time. Nothing needed adjusting. Nothing demanded attention. He picked up his keys, slid his phone into his pocket, and paused at the door. 2 weeks, he repeated softly. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, He turned the handle and stepped out. The drive was familiar in the way certain songs were, recognizable without conscious effort. Brian followed the route almost automatically, his mind drifting in and out of focus as the city gave way to quieter stretches of road. He didn't rush. There was no reason to. About halfway through the drive, his phone buzzed again, nestled in the cup holder beside him. He glanced at it during a stoplight. Mark. Brian hesitated, then tapped the screen. Mark, out of town? Since when do you travel? Brian considered the question, a faint hint of something almost like amusement tugging at the corner of his mouth. He typed back. Recently, I guess. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Mark, fair enough. Where'd you go? Brian stared at the message a second longer this time. A simple question. A reasonable one. He tapped the screen again. Home. Just visiting family. There was another pause. Then, Mark, didn't know you had family nearby. Brian leaned back slightly in his seat as the light turned green, easing his foot onto the gas pedal. Of course you didn't, he said under his breath, not unkindly. He typed one more reply. About an hour and a half out. This time, the response took longer. When it came, it was brief. Mark, cool. Have a good trip. Thanks, Brian said aloud, though the text exchange had already ended. He set the phone down again, eyes returning to the road. The conversation lingered in his thoughts, not because of anything said, but because of what hadn't been. He hadn't hidden anything. They just hadn't asked, and he hadn't offered. The realization didn't sting. It simply clarified something. By the time Brian pulled into his parents' driveway, the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the yard. The house looked exactly as he remembered, unchanged in all the ways that mattered. Before he even turned off the engine, the front door opened. His mother stepped out first, followed closely by his father. Brian, she called, already halfway down the steps. Brian smiled, genuinely easily, as he opened the car door. I'm home, he said, and for the first time in a long while the words felt like they carried weight. Something he thought might finally be starting. Chapter 2, Familiar Roads, Unfamiliar Thoughts. Brian woke earlier than he intended. It wasn't the bed. His childhood mattress was softer than the one in his apartment by a noticeable margin. Nor was it the noise, because there was none. It was the quiet, particular kind that came from being in a place where time moved differently. For a moment, he lay still, staring at the ceiling he hadn't really looked at in nearly a decade. The faint crack near the corner was still there. He remembered tracing it once with his eyes as a teenager, imagining it spreading like a map. Still holding up, he murmured. A soft knock came at the door before it opened. His mother leaned in slightly, already dressed, already energized in a way Brian associated with early mornings and purposeful days. You're awake, she said, smiling as though this confirmed something she had predicted. Yeah, Brian replied, pushing himself up onto his elbows. Didn't mean to be. His mother stepped fully into the room, arms loosely folded. You always wake up early when you're home, even when you were little. Brian blinked. I did. 6 o'clock, like clockwork, she said. You'd come into the kitchen and just sit there. Wouldn't say anything. Just sit. He let out a small, surprised laugh. That sounds about right. Coffee? She asked. Yeah, he said, then added, please. She nodded once and disappeared down the hall. Brian swung his legs off the bed and stood, stretching slowly. The house felt unchanged, but not stagnant. More like it had continued living while he had been elsewhere. He got dressed quickly and followed the faint smell of coffee down the hall and into the kitchen. His father was at the table, newspaper open, glasses perched low on his nose. He glanced up as Brian entered. There he is, his dad said. The traveler. Brian huffed softly. It's a 90-minute drive. Still counts, his father replied, folding the paper slightly. You crossed at least 2 towns. That's commitment. Brian smiled faintly, slipping into the chair across from him. I'll take the credit. His mother slid a mug in front of him. Big plans today? Brian hesitated just long enough for both of them to notice. Not really, he said. I thought I'd walk around, see what's changed. His father made a non-committal sound. Things change. Then they don't. That helpful insight come with the paper? Brian asked. No, his dad said, entirely serious. That's experience. Brian took a sip of coffee to hide his smile. They didn't press him for more detail, and he appreciated it. Conversation flowed easily into familiar, low-stakes topics, neighbors, weather, a cousin's recent move. It wasn't deep, but it wasn't shallow either. It was grounded. After breakfast, Brian grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. The air felt different here, cleaner, or maybe just quieter. He shoved his hands into his pockets and started walking without a fixed destination. The town hadn't changed much. The same grocery store stood at the corner, though the sign had been updated. The barber shop was still there. The small park he used to pass on his way to school looked exactly the same, right down to the faded bench near the entrance. He found himself slowing as he reached the main street, a short stretch lined with shops that had cycled through different owners over the years. One storefront caught his attention. It had been a hardware store when he was younger. Now the windows were filled with books, stacked, displayed, arranged in careful disorder. A small sign hung on the door, half storybooks and cafe. Brian tilted his head slightly. A bookstore, he said under his breath. Of course. He wasn't sure what prompted him to step inside. But he did. A soft bell chimed as the door opened. The smell of coffee blended with paper and something faintly citrus. Welcome in. The voice came from behind the counter. A woman looking up from a laptop, one hand already pushing her hair back as she noticed him. Brian paused just inside the doorway. Hi. She studied him for a second, not in a way that felt intrusive but attentive. First time? She asked. Brian glanced around, then nodded. Yeah. I'd remember you, she said simply, as if it were an obvious fact. That threw him slightly. Oh, he said. Okay. A small smile tugged at her lips. You can browse, no pressure. Coffee's over there, she added, pointing toward a small setup near the side wall. Or I can make something if you want to feel fancy. Brian shifted his weight. What qualifies as fancy? Anything that takes longer than pressing a button, she said. He let out a quiet laugh. Then I'll go simple for now. Bold choice, she replied, already turning back to her laptop. Brian moved further into the store, scanning the shelves without much direction. Titles blurred together as his focus drifted. Not on the books, but on the simple act of being there. Felt different. Not uncomfortable. Just unfamiliar. After a few minutes, he picked up a book almost at random and brought it to the counter. The woman looked up again. You find something? Or are you committing to the first thing you made eye contact with? Brian blinked. Is it that obvious? Extremely, she said. You didn't even read the back. He glanced down at the book. She wasn't wrong. I was going to, he said. Sure you were. There was no judgment in her tone. Just a quiet amusement that didn't feel heavy. Brian hesitated, then set the book down. Do you have a recommendation? Her eyebrows lifted slightly, like he'd surprised her. For you? She asked. Is that a problem? No, she said slowly. Just unexpected. Most people pretend they know what they want. Brian shrugged lightly. I don't. She studied him again, more carefully this time. Okay, she said, closing her laptop. Give me something to work with. Brian opened his mouth, then stopped. He started, then paused. I don't really read much. That's not a personality trait, she said. I didn't say it was. Good, she replied. Because I'd reject it. Brian huffed a quiet laugh despite himself. All right, he tried again. Something, not complicated. Emotionally, intellectually, or structurally? She asked immediately. He blinked. All three. She shook her head. Too vague. Narrow it down. Brian frowned slightly, thinking. Something that makes me want to keep reading, he said finally. That's it. She considered that for a moment, then nodded. Okay, I can work with that. She disappeared between the shelves, leaving Brian at the counter. He found himself watching where she'd gone, as if expecting her to reappear immediately. She didn't. When she returned, she held out a book without ceremony. Try this. Brian took it, glancing at the cover. What's it about? He asked. You'll find out, she said. That's not helpful. It's intentional, she corrected. You overthink before you even start. This removes that step. Brian stared at her for a moment, then shook his head faintly. You don't know me. She tilted her head. You walked into a bookstore, didn't look at a single back cover, picked a book at random, then asked for help because you didn't trust your own choice. Brian opened his mouth, then closed it again. That's fair, he admitted. She smiled, satisfied. I'm Lily, by the way. Brian. Nice to meet you. Brian, who doesn't trust his own decisions. He almost laughed at that. I trust them, he said. I just don't prioritize them. Lily leaned against the counter slightly. That sounds like the same thing, but with extra steps. Brian considered arguing, then didn't. Maybe, he said. She nodded once. Well, for the next few hours at least, you get to prioritize one. He held up the book slightly. Reading this. Or not, she said. But if you don't, you have to admit I was right about you. Brian narrowed his eyes slightly. That feels like a trap. It is, she said easily. He looked at the book again, then back at her. Fine, he said. I'll read it. Good, she replied, ringing it up. I'll expect feedback. Expect? He echoed. Yes, Lily said. You seem like the kind of person who disappears if no one asks you anything. So I'm asking. Brian went still for just a fraction of a second. Then he nodded. All right, he said quietly. I'll come back. Lily handed him the receipt, her expression unreadable but not unkind. I'll be here, she said. As Brian stepped back out into the sunlight, book in hand, he felt something shift. Not dramatically, not overwhelmingly. Just enough to notice. For once, someone had asked. And for once, he hadn't turned away from answering. Chapter 3, the question nobody asked. Brian did not open the book immediately. He placed it on the nightstand that evening, careful not to crease the cover, as though the act of reading it required a level of preparedness he had not yet reached. Instead, he sat on the edge of his bed, elbows resting on his knees, staring at nothing in particular, while his thoughts circled something he couldn't quite pin down. Lily's words lingered longer than expected. You seem like the kind of person who disappears if no one asks you anything. He exhaled slowly. That's not wrong, he admitted to the quiet room. It's just incomplete. The problem, he realized, was that he wasn't sure what the rest of that sentence looked like. Brian leaned back and lay down, folding his hands behind his head as he stared at the ceiling again. It struck him, faintly, that he had spent most of his life reacting, responding when prompted, moving when asked, speaking when addressed. It had worked. It still worked. But now there was something developing at the edge of that understanding, something uncomfortable but not unpleasant. Like realizing there had been a door nearby all along, and he'd simply chosen not to open it. He turned his head, looking at the book. I said I'd read it, he muttered. After a brief pause, he reached over, picked it up, and opened to the first page. It turned out Lily had been right about at least one thing. He kept reading. Brian didn't notice the passage of time until he shifted slightly and realized his arm had gone numb. He flexed his fingers absent-mindedly, eyes still scanning the page. Okay, he said under his breath, more surprised than anything else. He wasn't used to being pulled into anything. Not like this. When he finally closed the book, it was late enough that the house had gone completely still. He checked the time and blinked, mildly impressed. Guess I owe her feedback, he said. The thought felt new. He could have left it there, could have simply enjoyed the book and moved on. But that wasn't the arrangement. She had asked, and he had answered. That meant something now. The next morning, Brian woke with more clarity than he had the day before. Not certainty, he wasn't expecting that to arrive all at once, but momentum. A small shift forward that felt deliberate. He got dressed with less hesitation, grabbed the book without overthinking it, and headed out before breakfast could anchor him into another slow morning. Going somewhere? His father called from the living room. Yeah, Brian replied, slipping on his shoes. I'll be back later. His father nodded without questioning it. All right, don't get lost. I know the town, Brian said. That doesn't mean you know where you're going, his dad returned calmly. Brian paused, then smiled faintly. Fair point. The bell chimed again as Brian stepped into the bookstore. Lily didn't look up immediately this time. She was rearranging a stack of books on a nearby table, expression focused but not serious. You came back, she said after a moment, still not facing him. You said you'd expect it, Brian replied. Expectation isn't confirmation, she said, straightening one last book before finally glancing over. She noticed the book in his hand immediately. Oh, she said, something like approval flickering across her face. You actually read it. I said I would. People say a lot of things, she replied. Completion rate is low. Brian stepped closer to the counter, setting the book down. It was good, he said simply. Lily tilted her head slightly. That's it. He frowned. You want a summary? No, she said quickly. I want to know what you thought. Brian hesitated. It wasn't a difficult question in theory, but in practice, he realized he wasn't used to forming answers like that. Most of his conversations didn't require it. He started, then paused again. I liked how it didn't rush anything. Her expression shifted, subtle, but attentive. Go on, she said. Brian exhaled quietly. The characters didn't immediately understand everything. They had to figure things out over time, and they didn't always get it right. Lily nodded once. Anything else? He looked down at the book again. It didn't assume they'd be noticed, he added. They had to decide to be. The words seemed to settle between them, heavier than he intended. Lily leaned lightly against the counter, studying him. That sounds less like a review and more like a personal takeaway, she said. Brian blinked. Isn't that the same thing? Not usually, she replied. He shrugged faintly. That's what stood out. Lily considered him for a moment longer, then crossed her arms loosely. All right, she said. Then answer something else. Brian raised an eyebrow slightly. Okay. Why don't you prioritize your own decisions? The question landed directly, without softness. Brian didn't flinch, but he didn't answer right away either. I do, he said after a moment. You don't, she replied evenly. He exhaled through his nose. You don't know that. I asked you what you wanted yesterday, she said. You couldn't answer. That was one question. That was the question. Brian crossed his arms, mirroring her posture without meaning to. It's not that simple, he said. It usually is, she countered. He shook his head slightly, frustration creeping in. Not directed at her, but at the conversation itself. I don't need a lot, he said. That's all. That's not what I asked. Brian went quiet. Lily didn't press immediately this time. She straightened, giving the silence room to exist. After a few seconds, Brian uncrossed his arms, letting them fall to his sides. I don't expect things, he said finally. Why not? Because expectations lead to disappointment, he replied, almost automatically. Lily's expression didn't change. That sounds like something you decided once and never questioned again, she said. Brian gave a small, humorless smile. It worked. Did it? She asked. He hesitated. That same unsettled feeling from the night before returned. Stronger now, more defined. I'm not unhappy, he said. That wasn't the question either, Lily replied. Brian looked at her, really looked this time, trying to decide whether she was being deliberately difficult. She wasn't. She was being direct. Then what is the question? He asked quietly. Lily tilted her head, considering him. Are you choosing your life? She said. Or are you just maintaining it? The words landed harder than anything she'd said so far. Brian's first instinct was to answer quickly, to deflect, to simplify, to move on. Instead, he stopped himself. He thought. And in doing so, he realized something unsettling. He didn't have an immediate answer. I don't know, he admitted. Lily nodded slowly, as though that was the answer she'd expected. Okay, she said. Brian blinked. Okay. Yes, that's it. For now, she replied. You don't get a solution until you sit with the question. Brian let out a short breath, halfway between a laugh and resignation. You're not very subtle. I'm not trying to be, she said. There was a pause, but this one felt different, less tense, more grounded. Brian glanced around the bookstore, then back at her. So what happens now? He asked. Lily considered him for a moment, then gestured toward the shelves. Now, she said. You pick the next book. Brian stared at her. You just said I don't trust my own decisions. Exactly, she replied. So this is where you start. That feels like a setup. It is, she said again, completely unapologetic. Brian looked at the shelves, then back at her. And if I pick something terrible, then you'll survive, Lily said. And we'll talk about why you picked it. He hesitated, then nodded once. All right. As he stepped away from the counter and toward the shelves, Brian felt something unfamiliar settle in. Not certainty, not confidence, but intention. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't waiting to be asked. He was choosing. And even if it was something as small as a book, it felt like a beginning. Chapter 4: A Habit of Disappearing. Brian did not pick quickly. He stood in front of the shelves longer than he had the day before, scanning titles, then scanning them again as though repetition might produce clarity. His instinct was still the same, to choose something at random, minimize the decision, move forward. But Lily was watching. Not obviously. She had returned to her laptop, posture relaxed, eyes occasionally flicking up for less than a second at a time. Still, he knew. This wasn't about the book. Overthinking already? She called out without looking up. Brian exhaled quietly. I'm evaluating. Evaluation implies criteria, she replied. Do you have any? He paused. Progress, he said after a second. Toward what? That's part of the evaluation, he said, a little more firmly than he intended. Lily finally looked up, one eyebrow lifting slightly. That sounded confident, she said. Suspicious. Brian ignored that, stepping forward and pulling a book from the shelf. He flipped it over, actually reading the back this time. The action felt deliberate, slower. You're doing it on purpose now, Lily observed. Brian glanced over. Doing what? Taking your time, she said. That's new. He shrugged faintly. You said I rush. I said you skip, she corrected. This is different. He considered that, then returned his attention to the book. The summary was vague but intriguing enough. He didn't analyze it further. All right, he said, turning back to her. This one. Lily leaned forward slightly, squinting at the cover. Interesting choice, she said. That doesn't sound reassuring. It's not criticism, she replied. Just unexpected again. Brian held it out slightly. Are you going to approve it? No, Lily said. That defeats the point. I'm just going to judge you afterward. He huffed a small laugh. Of course you are. She rang it up without more commentary, then slid it back toward him. So, she said casually, what are you doing for the rest of the day? Brian blinked. It was such a normal question that it took a second to register how rarely he was asked it. Nothing planned, he said. Lily tilted her head. Is that intentional? Yes, he said after a beat. That's not convincing. Brian leaned slightly against the counter, unconsciously mirroring her earlier posture. I didn't come here with a schedule, he explained. Okay, she said. So now you're here. What next? He glanced toward the door, then back at her. I'll go read, he said, lifting the book slightly. Where? She asked. At home. You drove all the way here to go back home and do something you could have already started? She said flatly. Brian hesitated. That's not, he started, then stopped. Yes, that's what I was going to do. Lily studied him for a second, then pushed herself off the counter. Come on. Brian straightened. What? Come on, she repeated, gesturing toward the door. There's a park 2 blocks over. Benches, shade, minimal distractions. You can read there. Brian blinked. You're sending me away? I'm relocating you, she said. Important distinction. I didn't ask for relocation. No, she agreed. You didn't ask for anything. That's the problem. Brian let out a slow breath, unsure whether to push back or not. You're very decisive for someone who doesn't know me, he said. Lily smiled faintly. I know enough. That feels like an overstatement. Does it? She asked. You've been here twice and already told me you don't prioritize your own choices. That's a strong starting point. Brian opened his mouth, then closed it again. Exactly, she said, already turning toward the door. Let's go. He hesitated for half a second longer before following her out. The walk was short, quiet in a way that didn't feel forced. Brian kept pace beside her, hands in his jacket pockets, still trying to decide how he'd been convinced into this. You don't usually do this, do you? He said. Do what? Redirect strangers' afternoons. Lily glanced at him. You're not a stranger anymore. You're a returning customer. That feels like a technicality. It is, she said. But it still counts. Brian shook his head faintly, but there was no real resistance left in him. The park came into view gradually, small but well-kept. A few people sat scattered across benches, some reading, some just existing in the space. Lily pointed toward an empty bench beneath a tree. There, she said. Optimal balance of shade and visibility. Visibility to whom? Brian asked. To me, obviously, she replied. He stopped walking. You're staying. For a bit, she said. I brought my own book. Brian stared at her, genuinely caught off guard. You followed me here to supervise? I walked with you, she corrected. And I'm not supervising. I'm observing. That sounds worse. It's not, she said lightly. It just makes you accountable. Brian considered that for a moment. I could just leave, he pointed out. You could, Lily agreed. But you won't. He narrowed his eyes slightly. You're very sure of that. You came back this morning, she said simply. That stopped him. Brian exhaled slowly, then let it go. Fine, he said, sitting down on the bench. I'll stay. Lily nodded once and sat at the opposite end, giving him space without making it feel like distance. For a while, neither of them spoke. Brian opened his book, settling into the familiar act of reading. But this time, the context felt different. The presence beside him wasn't distracting. Exactly. Just noticeable. After a few minutes, Lily broke the silence. You're holding it too tightly. Brian blinked, glancing over. What? The book, she said. You're gripping it like it might run away. He looked down at his hands, adjusting his grip slightly. Habit, he said. Of what? Not dropping things, he replied. Lily smiled faintly, then returned to her own book. Try not guarding it, she said. It's not fragile. Brian frowned slightly, then forced his hands to relax. He went back to reading. Time passed without either of them acknowledging it directly. At some point, Brian became aware of something unexpected. Not in the book, not in the park. In himself. He wasn't just reading. He wasn't just passing time. He had chosen to be here. The thought settled in quietly, but firmly. He closed the book after a while, exhaling through his nose. Lily noticed immediately. Done already? Brian shook his head. No, just stopping point. That's new too, she said. What is? Stopping before you're finished, she replied. Usually people either rush through or don't start at all. Brian glanced out at the park, then back at her. I didn't feel like I needed to finish it right now. Lily nodded slowly. That's progress. He gave a small, uncertain laugh. You keep saying that. Because you keep doing it. Brian leaned back against the bench, looking up through the branches overhead. This is strange, he admitted. What is? This, he said, gesturing vaguely. Being here. Like this. Lily tilted her head. In a park. In a situation I didn't plan, he clarified. And you survived, she said. Barely. She laughed, that time fully without restraint. Brian turned slightly, surprised. What? He asked. You're dry, she said. I wasn't expecting that. Most people aren't expecting anything, he replied. Lily studied him again, something sharper in her expression now. That's not true, she said quietly. They just stopped expecting from you. Brian didn't respond immediately, because this time the statement didn't feel observational. Felt precise. That's different, he said after a moment. It doesn't have to be, she replied. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. Brian looked down at the book in his hands, then back out at the park. I don't think I ever gave them a reason to, he said. Lily didn't answer right away. When she did, it was softer. Then maybe that's the part that changes. Brian sat with that, not rejecting it, not accepting it either, just holding it there. For once, not letting it pass unnoticed. Chapter 5, The People Who Stayed. Brian didn't go back to the bookstore the next morning. Not because he didn't want to, but because for the first time he paused before acting on expectation. Lily would be there. She had said so. It would have been simple to return, to continue the pattern they were forming. There was comfort in it already, a rhythm that had started to take hold. but something she'd said lingered. Are you choosing your life or just maintaining it? So instead, Brian chose differently. He stayed with his family. You're hovering, his mother said, not looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. Brian leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed loosely. I'm standing. You've been standing there for 10 minutes, she replied. That's not hovering. That's extended standing. His mother smiled faintly. Go sit. I don't want to sit. Then help, she said, sliding a bowl in his direction. Brian complied, picking up a knife and beginning to slice without needing further instruction. For a while, they worked in silence, not uncomfortable, not forced, just shared space. You seem different, she said after a minute. Brian paused briefly, then resumed cutting. Different how? More present, she said. Like you're actually here instead of visiting. He let out a quiet breath. I thought visiting meant being here. It does, she replied. But sometimes people arrive without really showing up. Brian considered that. I think I did that before, he said. His mother nodded once. You've always been good at being where you're needed. That's not the same thing. No, she said gently. It isn't. Brian set the knife down, leaning his hands against the counter. I didn't think there was much difference, he admitted. And now, he hesitated. Now I think I've been waiting, he said slowly. For what? She asked. He almost answered immediately, then stopped. I don't know, he said. His mother didn't fill the silence this time. She simply reached for another vegetable, continuing her work. You'll figure it out, she said after a moment. You always do. You just take longer because you don't start from yourself. Brian turned that over in his mind, the phrasing catching him slightly off guard. Start from myself, he repeated. Most people begin with what they want, she said. You begin with what's available. He leaned back against the counter. That's efficient, he said. It's safe, she corrected. There's a difference. Brian didn't argue, because he couldn't. Later that afternoon, Brian found himself back on the main street again. Not intentionally, just walking. The bookstore came into view sooner than he expected. He slowed slightly as he approached it, glancing through the window. Lily was inside, perched on a stool behind the counter, one foot hooked around the rung, flipping through a book with absent focus. Brian stopped. He wasn't sure why. He had every reason to go in. He'd been there 2 days in a row already. It wouldn't be unusual. But for a brief moment, something unfamiliar crept in. Something that felt like hesitation but wasn't rooted in avoidance. Felt observational. He was noticing the choice. Are you planning to stand out there all day? Or should I start charging admission? Brian blinked. Lily hadn't looked up. You didn't even see me, he said, pushing the door open. She finally glanced up, a faint smirk forming. Reflection in the glass, she said. You're not subtle. I wasn't trying to be. That's new, she replied. Brian stepped inside, the bell chiming behind him. I didn't come earlier, he said. Lily tilted her head slightly. I noticed. You noticed I wasn't here? You were here the last 2 mornings, she said. Patterns are easy to track. Brian nodded faintly. I stayed home instead, he said. Voluntarily? She asked. Yes. She closed her book and set it aside. That's progress, she said again. Brian exhaled through his nose. You really commit to that word. It keeps being accurate. He leaned lightly against the counter. I wasn't avoiding this, he clarified. I didn't say you were. Brian paused. Were you going to ask? He said. No, Lily replied. You're here now. That's more interesting. Brian studied her for a second. You don't chase explanations, he observed. She shrugged. People either offer them or they don't. Chasing usually gets you something rehearsed. That's fair, Brian said. Lily crossed her arms, watching him more closely now. So, she said, what did you do instead? Stayed with my family, he replied. And, Brian hesitated, then surprised himself by answering honestly. And I realized I don't start from what I want, he said. I start from what's there. Lily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she nodded slow, deliberate. Who told you that? She asked. My mom. Smart woman. Brian huffed a small laugh. Yeah, she is. There was a shift then, subtle but noticeable. The space between them felt less like observation and more like conversation. Why do you think that is? Lily asked. Brian leaned back slightly, considering. I think, he started, then stopped to refine it. I think it was easier not to want things directly. Easier how? No expectations, he said. No disappointment. There it is again, Lily murmured. Brian nodded faintly. I know. You already challenged that. I'm consistent, she said. That's one word for it. It's the correct word, she returned. Brian shook his head, but there was no weight behind it. I didn't think it mattered, he said. Wanting? She asked. Yeah. And now? He looked around the bookstore briefly, then back at her. Now I think I just never tested it, he said. Lily leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the counter. That's fixable, she said. Brian raised an eyebrow. You say that like it's simple. It is simple, she replied. It's not easy. Those are different things. Brian let out a quiet breath, nodding. All right, he said. Then what does testing it look like? Lily smiled faintly. Good question, she said. You're improving. I'm trying, he admitted. She studied him for a moment longer, then straightened. Let's start small, she said. What do you want to do right now? Brian blinked. It was the same kind of question as before, but this time it didn't feel as impossible. He didn't rush, didn't deflect. He thought, I want to stay out, he said slowly. Not go straight back home. Lily nodded once. Good. And, he added, surprising himself again, I wouldn't mind company. The words landed between them, quiet but clear. Lily's expression didn't change immediately, but something in her posture shifted, less guarded, more engaged. That's more specific, she said. Brian nodded. That's as far as I've got. It's enough, she replied. There was a brief pause, then she stepped out from behind the counter, grabbing her bag. All right, she said. I'm closing early. Brian blinked. Because I said that? Yes, Lily said. That feels like a big response. It's a proportional response, she corrected. You made a request. I'm answering it. Brian watched her as she moved around the shop, flipping a sign near the door and gathering a few things. You don't hesitate, he said. I decide, she replied. That quickly. Usually, she said. If I don't do it at all. Brian absorbed that slowly. Where are we going? He asked. Lily shrugged lightly. We'll figure it out. Brian smiled faintly. That's new for me too. Lily glanced over her shoulder as she opened the door. Then today's full of surprises. As Brian stepped out beside her, the door closing behind them with a soft click, he realized something with quiet certainty. This wasn't accidental anymore. Not the conversation. Not the company. Not the choice. For the first time, he wasn't just being included. He had asked, and someone had met him there. Chapter 6, The Distance Between Truths. Brian hadn't expected conversation to feel like momentum. Not the structured kind, the kind that led somewhere specific, but a quieter, steadier shift like a current that didn't pull so much as carry. Walking beside Lily that afternoon, he noticed he wasn't calculating the next step, or rehearsing responses, or bracing for silence. He was just there. So, Lily said, glancing over at him as they turned down another street. You've decided you want things now. Brian breathed out a small laugh. That's a strong summary. It's an accurate one, she replied. You asked for company yesterday. That qualifies. I qualified, he said. She brushed a strand of hair out of her face. Barely, but you made the attempt. I'm glad I met your minimum standard, he said dryly. You exceeded it, she corrected. Don't get carried away. Brian shook his head faintly, but there was a lightness to it now. They walked a few steps in silence before he spoke again. I don't think I avoided wanting things because I didn't care, he said slowly. Lily glanced at him without interrupting. I think I just learned to stop expecting them to happen, he continued. So wanting them didn't feel useful. That sounds lonely, she said, not unkindly. Brian considered that. It wasn't, he said at first. Or it didn't feel like it at the time. He paused, then added, I had people around me. Lily tilted her head. People you talked to? Yeah. Or people who talked at you? She asked. He exhaled quietly. Both, he admitted. Mostly which? Brian didn't answer immediately, because he knew the answer. Mostly the second, he said. Lily nodded once, not surprised. Then that's not the same thing as connection, she said. Brian looked ahead, hands slipping into his pockets as the weight of that settled. I didn't think I needed more, he said. And now, he shook his head slightly. Now I think I didn't know what more looked like. Lily slowed her pace just slightly, enough to shift the rhythm between them. It usually doesn't look dramatic, she said. It's smaller than people expect. Brian glanced at her. How small? She shrugged. You noticing you're part of the conversation instead of watching it. Brian's mouth twitched. That's specific. That's because it applies to you, she said simply. He didn't argue. Because it did. That evening, Brian sat on the back porch of his parents' house, elbows resting on his knees, phone in his hand. The screen was lit. The group chat. It had been active more in the past 2 days than usual, messages stacking in uneven bursts. He hadn't responded yet. Not because he was avoiding them, but because he didn't quite know how to re-enter the conversation. It had never required effort before. Now it did. He scrolled upward, reading from where Mark had first mentioned his trip. A few lines down, someone else had responded. Jenna. Wait, he's out of town? Since when? Ethan. He didn't say anything? Claire. Do we know where he went? Brian frowned slightly, thumb hovering over the screen. They sounded confused. Concerned? He kept reading. Mark, he said, visiting family. Apparently nearby. Derek. Nearby? We've known him for years. Sarah. How do we not know that? Brian leaned back slightly in his chair. That's fair, he murmured. The messages continued, shifting tone as they went. Jenna, do we actually know anything about him? There was a pause in the thread after that, long enough that Brian could almost feel it. Then, Claire, we know he's reliable. Ethan, and quiet. Sarah, and shows up. Brian's expression stilled. Then Derek again. Derek, that's not knowing someone. That's describing a chair. Brian let out a short breath, almost a laugh. Okay, he said aloud. That one's accurate. He scrolled a bit further. Mark, when's his birthday? The chat stalled again. Then one by one Jenna. I don't know. Claire, I don't either. Sarah, wait, seriously? Ethan, has it already passed this year? Brian stared at the screen. His thumb hovered over the keyboard. He could answer. It would take less than a second. Instead, he set the phone down on the armrest beside him. The air outside was still, the faint hum of evening settling into place. He didn't feel hurt. That surprised him. More than anything, he felt clarity. They didn't ask, he said quietly. And then, after a pause, I didn't tell them. The second part mattered more than the first. Brian leaned back, staring up at the darkening sky. For years, he had assumed the shape of his relationships was fixed, defined by what was offered, what was accepted, what was left unsaid. Now, looking at that conversation, he realized something uncomfortable and honest. They hadn't excluded him. Not deliberately. They had built around the space he left open. And he had never filled it. Are you going to answer them? Brian glanced toward the doorway. His brother stood there, leaning casually against the frame, arms crossed. I didn't hear you come out, Brian said. You were focused, his brother replied, nodding toward the phone. Brian followed the gesture, then leaned forward to pick it up again. They just realized they don't know anything about me, he said. His brother raised an eyebrow. And I'm not sure what to do with that. His brother stepped out onto the porch, taking a seat in the chair beside him. Well, he said, do you want them to? Brian blinked. The question was simple, direct, unavoidable. Yes, he said after a moment. Then tell them something, his brother said. Brian looked down at the phone again. That feels bigger than it should be, he said. Because you've never done it, his brother replied. Brian nodded faintly. That's probably true. His brother shrugged. Start small. Brian unlocked the screen, the group chat still open, still waiting. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He thought of Lily. You don't get a solution until you sit with the question. He thought of his mom. You don't start from yourself. And then, for the first time with them, he did. He typed, hey, I'm visiting my family. I grew up about an hour and a half out of the city. He stopped. Read it. Then added, and my birthday is next week. He stared at the message for a second longer, then hit send. The reply came faster than he expected. Jenna. Wait. Brian? Mark. There he is. Sarah. Next week? Why didn't we know that? Brian watched the messages stack up, something unfamiliar settling in again. This time, it wasn't uncertainty. It wasn't hesitation. It was participation. His brother nudged his shoulder lightly. See? Not that complicated. Brian nodded, a faint smile forming. Not complicated, he echoed. Then softer, just new. Later that night, as he lay in bed, Brian stared at the ceiling again. But this time, his thoughts didn't circle the same questions. They moved forward. He didn't know what would come of any of this, with Lily, with his friends, with himself. But for the first time in a long while, that uncertainty didn't feel like something to avoid. It felt like something to step into. Across town, Lily locked up the bookstore alone, flipping the sign and stepping out into the quiet street. She paused for a moment, looking down at her phone. No new messages. She tucked it away without checking anything else. Interesting, she murmured to herself. Brian Collins was not what she expected. He was quieter than most people, more deliberate. But underneath that, there was something else, something she hadn't quite figured out yet. Not absence, not emptiness, just distance, the kind that didn't ask to be crossed, until suddenly it did. Lily smiled faintly as she started walking home. All right, she said softly. Let's see where this goes. Chapter 7, The Day That Wasn't Forgotten. Brian did not expect his 30th birthday to feel different. For most of his life, birthdays had passed quietly, acknowledged by his parents, occasionally mentioned by extended family, but never marked in a way that felt particularly significant. It had never bothered him. It had simply been. Now, standing in the living room as his mother adjusted a stack of plates, and his father debated the placement of chairs like it was a strategic exercise, Brian realized something had already changed. This time, he was aware of it. You're thinking too much, his father said, not looking at him. I haven't said anything, Brian replied. Exactly, his father said. That's how I know. Brian exhaled softly, crossing his arms. It's just a birthday, he said. His mother glanced over, unimpressed. It's not just a birthday. It's your birthday. That doesn't make it more dramatic, Brian said. It makes it more meaningful, she countered. Brian let that sit, unsure how much of it he actually believed. But he didn't argue, because something about this one did feel different. By early afternoon, the house had filled in the quiet, steady way his family always gathered. Aunts, uncles, cousins, voices overlapping, conversations weaving in and out of each other. It wasn't loud in a chaotic way. It was structured noise, familiar noise. Brian moved through it easily, responding when spoken to, contributing more than usual, not by force but by choice. At one point, his cousin nudged him lightly. "You're talking more," she said. Brian blinked. "Am I?" "Yeah," she said. "Don't stop. It suits you." He gave a small, uncertain smile. "I'll try to maintain the momentum." "That's the most you sentence I've ever heard," she said, laughing. Brian was about to respond when the doorbell rang. His mother moved toward it automatically, wiping her hands on a towel. "Expecting someone else?" Brian called. "No," she said, reaching for the handle. The door opened, and for a second, everything on the other side stood still. Brian didn't recognize what he was seeing. Not right away. His brain tried to place it, categorize it, assign meaning. Then it clicked. Mark stood at the front, hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. Behind him, Jenna, Claire, Sarah, Ethan, Derek. All 6 of them, in a line that felt too deliberate to be accidental. Brian stepped forward slowly. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Mark exhaled, glancing briefly over his shoulder before looking back at him. "Showing up," he said. It wasn't a polished answer, but it was an honest one. Jenna lifted a small, slightly dented cake box. "We didn't know what kind you like," she said quickly, like she needed to explain. "So we got chocolate." It felt safe. Brian stared at them. Not because he didn't understand what was happening, but because he did, and it didn't match anything he expected. "You drove here?" he asked. Ethan gave a small shrug. "It's not that far." "That's not the point," Brian said. "No," Derek said, stepping forward slightly. "It's exactly the point." There was a pause, longer than comfortable but too important to cut short. Brian looked at each of them in turn. Something in their expressions had shifted. They weren't casual. They weren't automatic. They were present. "You didn't have to do this," Brian said quietly. Claire shook her head. "We did. You didn't even know when my birthday was until 2 days ago," Brian said. Not accusing, just stating. "And that," Sarah said, "is kind of the problem." The honesty of it landed without defense. Brian let out a slow breath. "Okay," he said. Then, "Come in." The house adjusted quickly to the additional people. Chairs pulled in, introductions made, space redistributed. Brian watched his worlds meet with something like detached awareness at first. His family welcomed them easily, without hesitation. "So you're the friends," his mother said, smiling warmly. "We are," Mark said, then added more honestly. "I think." That earned a small ripple of laughter, easing some of the tension. Brian stayed near the edge of it for a moment, observing, until Jenna stepped beside him. "We should have come sooner," she said quietly. Brian glanced at her. "You didn't know where I lived." "We could have asked," she said. He nodded faintly. "You could have. And you could have told us," she added. Brian looked down briefly, then back up. "Yeah," he said. "I could have." That was the part he didn't avoid now. Responsibility didn't land on one side anymore. It balanced. Across the room, Derek was mid-conversation with Brian's father, clearly trying to follow a story that had taken too many turns. "Wait, so the lawnmower was on fire or—" "It wasn't on fire," Brian's dad said. "It was near fire. Big difference." "That feels like a technicality," Derek said. "It is," his dad agreed. "But it's an important one." Brian smiled faintly. Felt strange, but not wrong. "Hey!" Brian turned. Lily stood in the doorway. Not dramatic, not announced, just there. For a split second, the room narrowed, not in exclusion but in focus. "You came," Brian said. "I said I'd show up if it mattered," she replied. Brian blinked. "You didn't say that." "I implied it," she corrected. He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. "That tracks." Lily stepped inside, eyes scanning the room briefly before landing back on him. "You've got a full audience," she said. "Unexpectedly," Brian replied. "I like unexpected," she said. "It means something changed." Brian nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "It does." Lily studied him, only for a second but long enough to notice. "You look different," she said. Brian raised an eyebrow. "That's been a common theme." "This is new," she said. "You're not standing at the edge." He glanced around the room. He wasn't. "I didn't realize that," he said. "I did," she replied. There was a small beat, then Brian gestured inside. "You can stay," he said. "I was planning on it," Lily returned. The cake was slightly uneven, the candles mismatched in height, and the singing only loosely synchronized. It was objectively imperfect, and for Brian it was the most intentional moment he could remember. As the candles flickered in front of him, everyone watching, family, friends, Lily just off to the side. He realized something quietly, but with complete clarity. This wasn't about being noticed. It wasn't about attention. It was about presence. Real, deliberate presence. Make a wish, someone said. Brian looked at the candles, then up at the people in front of him. He didn't rush, didn't default, didn't minimize. He thought. And for once, he knew the answer before anyone asked. He leaned forward and blew out the candles. Later, as conversations broke into smaller groups and the energy softened, Brian found himself outside again, on the porch, leaning against the railing. The door creaked behind him. Lily stepped out, closing it gently. "There a lot," she said. Brian huffed a quiet laugh. "In a good way?" She nodded. "Mostly." They stood side by side, silence settling comfortably between them. After a moment, Lily spoke again. "You didn't disappear," she said. Brian glanced at her. "No. You could have," she added. "I know. But you didn't." Brian looked out into the dark yard. "They showed up," he said. "So I stayed." Lily nodded slowly. "That's fair." There was a pause. Then Brian spoke again, more quietly this time. "I think I used to believe that if I didn't take up space, I couldn't lose anything." Lily didn't interrupt. "But that also meant I didn't gain anything either," he finished. She exhaled softly. "That's the trade-off." Brian nodded. "Yeah." He turned slightly toward her. "I don't think I want to do that anymore." Lily met his gaze, her expression steady. "Good," she said. Another pause settled in, but this one wasn't uncertain. It was something else, something that waited. Brian didn't rush it. For once, he didn't default to silence or retreat. He stepped forward just enough. "I'm glad you came," he said. Lily's expression softened, just slightly. "Me too," she replied. And for the first time, the distance between them didn't feel undefined. Felt crossed. Chapter 8 Invitations finally asked. The city looked the same when Brian returned. Same streets, same steady movement of people who seemed to know exactly where they were going. Nothing had rearranged itself to reflect what had shifted in him. The familiar skyline didn't pause in acknowledgement, didn't signal that anything meaningful had occurred. And yet, as he stood just inside his apartment, keys still in his hand, Brian knew something was undeniably different. Not outside, inside. He set his bag down without rushing to unpack it, letting the quiet of his space settle around him again. It wasn't uncomfortable, not like it might have been before. It was simply his. For a moment he stood there, considering the room. The same furniture, the same arrangement, the same life that had once felt complete enough simply because it didn't demand more. "It's not enough anymore," he said quietly. The words didn't carry frustration. They carried certainty. Brian walked toward the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water out of habit, then leaning lightly against the counter as he glanced at his phone. There were messages waiting, not just one or two. A thread that had continued since his birthday. Updates, jokes, a few pictures someone had taken at the house. And, more recently, "Mark, coffee this Friday?" Brian smiled faintly. The pattern, unchanged. The invitation, assumed. But now it felt like a starting point, not the entire structure. He typed, "Friday works, but let's do dinner after." He paused, then added, "I'll pick the place." He stared at the message for a second longer than necessary, then sent it. The response came quickly, but the tone had shifted. "Mark, dinner? Jenna. Okay, wait. Brian picking a place? I'm curious now. Sarah? I'm in. Ethan? Same. Claire? Absolutely." Brian watched the thread unfold, something settling into place. Not tension, not anticipation. Ownership. For once, he wasn't stepping into something already formed. He was shaping it. 2 days later, Brian stood outside the restaurant 15 minutes early. Not because he had to be, because he chose to be. He checked the time, then glanced through the window, confirming his reservation had been set properly. Everything was in place. Nothing left to chance. Over-prepared. Brian turned. Lily stood a few steps behind him, hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket, expression carrying that same observant calm he'd come to recognize. "A little," he admitted. "Consistent," she said. "Just redirected." Brian smiled faintly. "I'll take that." She stepped up beside him, glancing at the restaurant sign. "You picked this?" "Yeah." "Why?" Brian considered the question, not because he didn't know, but because he wanted the answer to be exact. "Because I wanted to," he said. Lily nodded once, approval quiet but unmistakable. "That's a better answer than I was expecting." "I'm improving," he said. "So you keep telling me," she replied. There was a small pause, then Brian looked at her. "You didn't have to come tonight," he said. Lily tilted her head. "That sounds like an old sentence," she said. Brian exhaled softly. "Yeah, it does." He corrected himself. "I'm glad you did." Lily's expression softened slightly. "Better," she said. The door opened behind them as one of Brian's friends arrived. "Okay, I don't even recognize this situation," Derek said, stopping short as he spotted them. "You're early. There's a reservation. And we're doing dinner. Try to keep up." Brian replied deadpan. Derek stared at him for a second, then laughed. Yeah. Something happened to you. Brian didn't deny it. Yeah, he said. Something did. Dinner wasn't what it used to be. Not in structure, it still carried the same easy rhythm of conversation and overlapping stories, but in participation. Brian wasn't listening from the edges anymore. He leaned in. He responded. He asked questions, real ones, not just follow-ups designed to keep things moving. At one point, Claire paused mid-sentence, looking at him more carefully. You're different, she said. Brian nodded. I've heard that. No, she said, shaking her head slightly. I mean it. You're here. He didn't deflect. I know, he said. Jenna leaned forward. Okay. I have to ask. What happened on that trip? Brian glanced briefly at Lily, then back at them. I started paying attention, he said. That's it, Ethan asked. It's a start, Brian replied. Mark leaned back in his chair, considering him. We thought we knew you, he admitted. Brian nodded. I thought so too. And now? Sarah asked. Brian paused. Then he answered honestly. Now I think we just didn't talk about the right things. There was no accusation in it. Just recognition. That's fair, Mark said quietly. The table shifted then, not dramatically but distinctly. The conversation turned, not away from humor or ease, but deeper underneath it. Questions came, not rapid or overwhelming, but intentional. Where he grew up, what he liked, what he didn't, and for once Brian answered. Later that night, after everyone had gone their separate ways, Brian walked Lily to her car. The city felt quieter than usual, or maybe he was just hearing it differently. You handled that well, Lily said. Brian glanced at her. That felt like a test. It wasn't, she replied. You just think in those terms. He smiled faintly. Still working on that. You're doing fine, she said. They stopped beside her car, the moment slowing naturally rather than awkwardly. For a second, neither of them spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there didn't need to be. Then Brian broke the silence. I'm not going back to how things were, he said. Lily studied him. I didn't think you would. Brian exhaled slowly, then continued. I don't want to wait for people to ask anymore, he said. I don't want to be optional in my own life. You're not, she said. I know that now, he replied. There was a brief pause. Then he looked at her, directly, without hesitation. But I want you to stay in it. The words were steady, clear, chosen. Lily didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to, because something in her expression changed. Not surprise, not uncertainty. Recognition. Good, she said softly. Because I wasn't planning on leaving. Brian let out a quiet breath, something unspoken settling between them. Not a question, not a maybe, something decided. He stepped closer, not dramatically, not rushed. Just enough to close the space that had once felt undefined. This time it didn't linger. It didn't hesitate. It simply happened. Later, as Brian stood back in his apartment once more, the quiet didn't feel like an ending. Felt like space. Space he could fill. Space he could shape. He glanced at his phone again. Messages still there. Still active. But now they weren't the center of it. He was. Brian set the phone down and looked around his apartment one last time. Not as something static, but as something unfinished. For the first time, that didn't feel like a limitation. It felt like possibility. And this time, he wasn't waiting for an invitation. He was the one making it.